At 6 a.m. on December 2nd, 1805, the sky over Austerlitz was shrouded in dense fog. Napoleon and his generals huddled around a fire, planning a crucial battle. Just 1 year before, on the same day, he had crowned himself emperor at Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris, swearing to fight for the land and glory of France. Now, he needed a brilliant victory to fulfill his oath. Standing in his way were Tsar Alexander I of Russia and Emperor Francis II of Austria, leading 86,000 Russian and Austrian troops. Just a month earlier, through a textbook-perfect maneuver, the French army had captured 23,000 Austrian soldiers at Ulm with minimal losses and taken Vienna without a fight. But the reassembled Russian-Austrian army was preparing a counterattack. 3 emperors and 160,000 troops had gathered at their destined battleground, Austerlitz. A grand strategy was rapidly forming in Napoleon's mind. He positioned his left flank on the Santon Hill, forming an impregnable line led by his most fearless marshals, Lannes and Murat. He stationed his right flank in the river-laced village of Telmitz, deliberately appearing weak to lure the Allied forces into attacking. This was the most pressured position, so it had to be commanded by his strongest marshal, Davout. In the center, Napoleon's focus was firmly on the Pratzen Heights, the key to victory in this battle. This position was assigned to the seasoned Marshal Soult, with support from Bernadotte, and Napoleon was prepared to personally lead if necessary. After ensuring that all his generals fully understood their missions, Napoleon issued the command for a full-scale attack. He looked towards the sky, where the sun of Austerlitz was beginning to rise, and the thick fog was gradually lifting. All of Europe was waiting for the outcome of this battle of the 3 emperors, and their futures hung in the balance. In May 1800, Napoleon secretly led a newly assembled force towards Italy. There, French Marshal Massena was besieged in Genoa by the veteran Austrian General Melas. The situation was critical, and Melas expected Napoleon to march to the rescue, positioning his forces to block any attempt by the French to enter Italy. However, Napoleon had meticulously kept his plans secret, so much so that even his trusted chief of staff Berthier was unaware of their next destination. On May 20th, the French army crossed the Alps through the Great St. Bernard Pass and arrived in Italy. Napoleon then revealed their objective, not Genoa, nor Nice, but Milan. This brilliant move revitalized the stagnant Italian theater of war. During the arduous Alpine crossing, the French had to abandon much of their supplies and heavy artillery. But upon capturing Milan, they seized the Austrian supply base, turning it to their advantage. With their supply lines severed, the Austrians' retreat to the east was now completely cut off by the French forces. But the cost of this perfect plan was that Massena and his 12,000 French troops, besieged in Genoa, were completely sacrificed. On June 4th, out of ammunition and food, Massena announced a conditional surrender. Only 4,000 French soldiers could barely stand and leave Genoa. Massena was undoubtedly one of Napoleon's finest generals, but this battle left a significant rift between them. Massena resented Napoleon for abandoning him, while Napoleon complained that Massena didn't hold out for just 10 more days. With those 10 days, Napoleon could have captured Melas's forces without bloodshed, rather than risking disaster at Marengo. After the fall of Genoa, Melas's Austrian forces were resupplied by the British Navy. With his retreat cut off, Melas's best option was to abandon the northern front and return to Austria by sea to regroup. But this 70-year-old general was no ordinary commander. He had enlisted at 17 and had followed Field Marshal Daun in defeating Frederick the Great during the 7 Years' War. Just a year earlier, he and Field Marshal Suvorov had swept through the northern front, proving unstoppable. To retreat now, with Napoleon advancing, would be to destroy his own reputation. On the other hand, Melas keenly spotted Napoleon's significant flaw: overconfidence. Napoleon never considered the possibility of a counterattack by Melas. He continuously divided his forces to guard various key points, aiming to annihilate the Austrian army. On June 13th, Napoleon led 15,000 French troops into Marengo, intending to intercept the remnants of the Austrian forces retreating to Genoa. But when he received the reconnaissance report, he was instantly alarmed. What he faced was not a remnant, but the main Austrian force. Melas had assembled 30,000 troops and 92 cannons, lying in wait at Marengo for Napoleon to take the bait. Melas ordered his entire army to settle the matter in one decisive battle, giving the French no chance to catch their breath. On June 14th, the Battle of Marengo officially commenced. At 9:30 a.m., both sides opened fire. The French right wing was subjected to a ferocious bombardment from 40 Austrian cannons, resulting in heavy casualties. Fortunately, Mons arrived with 2 infantry brigades just in time to hold the line. On the left, the heavy cavalry brigade led by young Kellerman braved the artillery fire to launch several countercharges, temporarily suppressing the Austrian assault. In this battle, the French skirmish tactics played a crucial role. Utilizing Marengo's complex terrain, they fiercely counterattacked the Austrians, although each advance came at a high cost. The Austrians' superior firepower, however, began to take its toll. By 2 p.m., Marengo had completely fallen, and the French forces were retreating on 3 fronts. Lens was encircled and in grave danger on the right flank. To rescue Lens, Napoleon played his final card, 900 soldiers of the Consular Guard. These fearless warriors repelled 3 Austrian cavalry charges like a wall, buying precious time for the French to regroup. Despite constant retreat, the French forces avoided a full-scale rout, and Austrian losses were also staggering. Melas himself had 2 horses shot from under him, and the 70-year-old general suffered minor injuries from the falls. Advised to rest in the rear, Melas agreed and sent a dispatch to Vienna announcing his victory. However, the celebratory champagne was uncorked too soon. Desaix had arrived. Desaix had originally been ordered to take a corps north to block the enemy. Upon receiving Napoleon's urgent plea for help, he quickly realized the gravity of the situation and immediately ordered his troops to abandon their baggage and make a rapid return. He arrived on the battlefield just as the French lines were on the verge of collapsing. Desaix, who shared a close personal friendship with Napoleon, joked upon seeing the exhausted emperor, "This battle is lost. Now we must go in another one." The 6,000 fresh troops Desaix brought with him turned the tide, and the French counterattack began. At 5 p.m., the Austrian forces launched a final assault, intending to crush the remaining French troops. Instead, they were met with an unprecedentedly fierce barrage that stunned them. At this moment, the French cavalry under young Kellerman sounded the charge for a full-scale counterattack. The Austrians, having fought fiercely all day, were struck hardest at the brink of victory, and their morale collapsed instantly. The French forces, like tigers unleashed, swept across the battlefield. In this battle, the Austrians suffered 6,500 casualties, 3,000 were captured, and they lost 33 cannons. The French lost 1,000 men, had 3,600 wounded, and lost a general. Tragically, Desaix was struck by a bullet during the charge and died on the field. Napoleon was deeply grieved by the news, shedding tears on the battlefield for the first time in his life. He later erected 2 monuments in Paris to honor Desaix and inscribed his name on the Arc de Triomphe. Napoleon faced countless crises throughout his life, but few were as perilous as Marengo. Before this battle, he had just ascended to the pinnacle of power, with countless opponents eagerly awaiting his downfall. Defeat would have plunged him into an abyss from which there was no return. But Desaix's sacrifice and the victory at Marengo dispelled all doubt. Austria surrendered the following year, ceding all territories west of the Rhine and in Italy, marking the end of the Second Coalition against France. With the war finally over, Napoleon had the opportunity to implement his reforms. Over the past 4 years, due to the Directory's incompetence and corruption, France had reached a dire state. The British Navy was blockading the ports, bandits and deserters roamed the countryside, inflation was brewing a crisis, and partisan politics were tearing society apart. Now in power, Napoleon was determined to change all of this. The first issue to tackle was legislation. Since the outbreak of the Revolution, French society had been in constant turmoil primarily due to a lack of consensus. The role of law was to clearly define the boundaries of rights and responsibilities, uniting society under a common understanding. Thus, Napoleon appointed the renowned jurist canvassers to compile his greatest work, the Napoleonic Code. This monumental task involved synthesizing 14,000 statutes and 42 local codes into a unified legal system applicable to all citizens. It was a colossal project, but Napoleon relished it. He personally presided over 55 legislative sessions and used his authority to ensure every bill passed. The Napoleonic Code is considered one of the most significant achievements of the French Revolution. It established the principle of equality before the law, protected private property rights, abolished noble privileges, and ensured religious tolerance. To this day, the Napoleonic Code remains one of the most widely referenced legal codes in modern legislative history. It transcended the societal structure of the time, laying out a blueprint for a new society. While Napoleon eventually fell, his code did not. It became deeply ingrained in this new society, unstoppable and enduring. However, such a progressive code naturally faced significant resistance at the time. Without Napoleon's firm support, it would never have passed so smoothly. Legislation was a step forward for Napoleon, but he also took a step back by reconciling with the Catholic Church. France had a population of 28 million, with 23 million living in rural areas as peasants. These people were mostly illiterate and heavily reliant on the spiritual and cultural services provided by the Catholic Church. To them, the revolution in Paris was irrelevant, but the new government's forced requisitioning and church demolitions sparked fierce resistance. Peasants were the backbone of the French army, and the army was Napoleon's loyal base. So, in July 1801, the French government reached a concordat with the Vatican, allowing the Catholic Church to operate freely under the law and stay out of politics. Through this agreement, Napoleon successfully extended his influence into rural France. Countless missionaries praised his victories, read his bulletins, and mobilized millions of soldiers for him. Beyond this, Napoleon's reforms were also remarkably effective in other areas. He reorganized the gendarmerie and within 3 years had eradicated the bandits that plagued the French countryside. This achievement arguably won him more public favor than his stunning victories in Italy. On the other hand, Napoleon also actively sought the support of the financial bourgeoisie. In January 1800, the Bank of France was officially established, stabilizing the value of the franc through a gold and silver standard. The long-standing issue of inflation that had plagued the Republic's government was finally resolved, thanks primarily to the financial sector's confidence in Napoleon's leadership. However, the wealth he had plundered from Italy and the war reparations from Austria were also significant factors. When dealing with the financial sector, Napoleon used persuasion. When dealing with the media, he used a heavy hand. He ordered the closure of 60 out of the country's 73 newspapers, with the remaining 13 becoming his mouthpieces. Napoleon made no secret of his views on controlling public opinion, likening newspapers to an armory. Allowing them free rein was akin to sleeping next to a powder keg. From these reforms, it is evident that Napoleon was both the most radical reformer and the most stubborn conservative, depending entirely on what he needed at the time. Consequently, both factions were deeply dissatisfied with him, and he survived several assassination attempts. However, no one could deny that these vacillating policies miraculously stabilized France and enabled Napoleon to crown himself Emperor of the French. Now, he finally had the strength to confront his true enemy, Britain. Just as Cardinal Richelieu had led Catholic France into alliance with Protestant forces during the 30 Years' War, the industrialized and revolutionary England now sought to crush the French Revolution. The underlying logic of capitalist states is to maintain high-efficiency production while destroying the capacity of competitors, compelling them to provide raw materials and markets. Therefore, after the French Revolution, Britain was more anxious than any other feudal monarch in continental Europe. They understood all too well the productive power that a unified and revolutionary France could unleash. During the 7 coalitions against France, Britain spent a staggering £1.573 billion to eliminate this potential competitor. But even more astonishing was that this astronomical sum only accounted for 30% of Britain's annual fiscal expenditure. Behind Britain's seemingly bottomless financial resources was an extremely efficient financial system, hundreds of large factories operating around the clock, £200 million worth of annual cotton textile exports, and £30 million in special war funds provided by the Bank of England each year. This war didn't just fail to cripple the British economy, it actually stimulated industrial production. So, Prime Minister William Pitt the Younger knew very well before the war began that no matter how many battles Napoleon won, Britain would inevitably win the war. In July 1805, Britain, Austria, and Russia formed the Third Coalition against France. In September of the same year, Napoleon led 170,000 French troops eastward, quickly crossing the Rhine River, then pivoting 90 degrees to march towards Ulm on the banks of the Danube. This maneuver, described as the largest frontline change in history, completely disrupted the coalition's plans and cut off the Austrian retreat eastward. On October 20th, the Austrian forces at Ulm surrendered. Napoleon captured 17 generals, 23,000 soldiers, 59 cannons, and 40 battle flags almost without firing a shot. Remarkably, 100 years earlier, during the War of the Grand Alliance, Louis XIV had struggled with a similar-sized force in the same region for 9 years. Yet, Napoleon broke through the Austrian lines in just 1 month, demonstrating his decisiveness and terrifying speed of action. The day after the stunning victory at Ulm, another legendary battle was unfolding on the North Atlantic. On September 28th, British naval hero Admiral Nelson led his fleet to encircle the Franco-Spanish fleet at Cadiz. The combined fleet had 33 ships with 2,626 cannons, while the British had only 27 ships with 2,148 cannons. Despite being outnumbered in both ships and firepower, the British had an unparalleled advantage in the quality of their officers. Unlike the army, the navy couldn't train on land. Sailors had to learn how to set sails, steer, and fire cannons on the rolling sea, meaning naval experience could only be gained in real combat. Once the Navy had an early advantage, it was hard to surpass. Moreover, the basic unit in the Army is the soldier, while in the Navy, it is the ship. This means individual initiative is less effective in the Navy, where strict adherence to officers' commands is crucial to prevent chaos. The quality of British naval officers was second to none, with a century-old fleet and global routes. If Britain claimed second place, no one would dare claim first. And France? On the eve of the Revolution, perhaps they were a force to be reckoned with, but the Navy, closely tied to the monarchy, suffered greatly during the Revolution and was now severely lacking in talent. Admiral Villeneuve, commander of the combined fleet, was well aware of this and was reluctant to face Nelson unless absolutely necessary. On October 19th, Villeneuve ordered the Franco-Spanish fleet to break out, but unfavorable winds delayed their departure until noon on the 20th. At dawn on the 21st, Villeneuve spotted Nelson's fleet on the horizon, and a fierce battle was inevitable. At 6:10 a.m., Nelson made his move. The British fleet would sail in 2 columns to cut through the enemy's line. Traditionally, naval battles involved fleets lining up to engage side by side, with the side forming the T, gaining a massive firepower advantage. But Nelson abandoned this conventional tactic, intending instead to drive straight into the enemy's formation, splitting it in half and dragging them into a brutal melee, leveraging his officers' superior experience to prevail. This was his original Nelson touch. At 11:45 a.m., the Battle of Trafalgar began. Nelson's flagship, HMS Victory, signaled, "England expects that every man will do his duty." The British Navy, buoyed with morale, charged forward. The 2 columns sliced through the combined fleet, dividing it into 3 parts. The lead section fled the battlefield, while the remaining 2 fell into disarray and were swiftly destroyed. In this battle, the combined fleet lost 22 ships, while the British lost none. However, Nelson was fatally shot by a French sniper. Realizing he was dying, he ordered his men to keep his death a secret to maintain morale. By 4 p.m., Britain's greatest naval commander had passed away at the age of 47. The Battle of Trafalgar was a complete victory, ending Napoleon's dreams of invading Britain and establishing British naval supremacy for a century. Let's shift our focus from the sea back to the land. After the triumph at Ulm, Napoleon continued his eastward advance, effortlessly capturing Vienna. However, the main forces of the Russo-Austrian alliance, under the command of Kutuzov, had already retreated. Despite his relentless progress, Napoleon found himself in a perilous situation. Kutuzov avoided engagement because he was waiting for reinforcements. To the south, Archduke Charles was leading 90,000 Austrian troops back from Italy, held at bay by the tenacious Messina. To the north, Prussia was on the verge of joining the fray, which would add 200,000 troops to the coalition's forces. Adding to the challenge, Napoleon discovered that compared to prosperous Italy, Austria was desperately poor. His troops struggled to find supplies, forcing them to split up and forage, reducing his field army to 70,000 men. Napoleon urgently needed a decisive battle, but Kutuzov was unwilling to provide it. Thus, the French pursued the coalition forces for another week, covering 300 kilometers, before finally catching up to the main force. Despite reaching them, Kutuzov remained stationary, but the 2 emperors could wait no longer. Emperor Francis II of Austria was desperate to reclaim his capital, and Tsar Alexander I of Russia yearned for victory and glory. In a war council, Alexander I even challenged Kutuzov, asking if Marshal Suvorov would have feared Napoleon if he were still alive. Under pressure from the Tsar, Kutuzov had no choice but to comply. Meanwhile, in the French camp, Napoleon was eager to prevent any further delays by the coalition. He feigned a retreat, even ceding the strategic Pratzen Heights to the enemy. On November 28th, an aide-de-camp from the Tsar's staff visited the French camp to negotiate and gather intelligence. Napoleon deliberately allowed him to witness the French packing up and preparing to leave. Secretly, he ordered Davout and Bernadotte to rush to his aid. At 7 a.m. on December 2nd, 1805, the Battle of Austerlitz began precisely on schedule. As Napoleon had anticipated, the coalition's battle plan focused their superior numbers on the poorly defended Telnitz village in the south. With a 4:1 advantage, the coalition forces took Telnitz in just an hour and a half and began pressing towards the French center. At this critical moment, reinforcements from Davout arrived. Responding to Napoleon's orders, Davout's troops had completed a grueling 110-kilometer forced march in 48 hours. Upon reaching the battlefield, Davout immediately organized a counterattack and recaptured Telnitz from the coalition forces. What followed was a brutal tug-of-war, with both sides fiercely contesting every house, tree, and wall. The soldiers fought with bayonets drawn, neither side willing to yield. By 10:30, Davout's 10,000 troops had held off 36,000 coalition soldiers for 2 full hours. 11 of his 12 highest-ranking officers were dead, and all infantry reserves had been exhausted. Yet, the Third Corps stood firm like an unyielding wall, repelling every assault without retreat. Ultimately, it was Tsar Alexander I who made the fatal mistake. Now, let's rewind to an hour and a half earlier. At 9 a.m., Napoleon was anxiously watching the Pratzen Heights through his telescope. 4 Russian columns were stationed there, waiting for Davout's southern line to collapse. Napoleon, however, was waiting for them to descend. At 9:15, Napoleon finally saw the moment he had been waiting for. The impatient Tsar ordered the Russian troops on the Pratzen Heights to reinforce the southern front. This was the moment. Napoleon signaled to Soult, who had been waiting for this cue, and said, "Let's end this war." At 10 a.m., the sun rose over Austerlitz, and the dense fog began to lift. To their horror, the Russian troops saw 23,000 French soldiers advancing in columns. With hardly any shots fired, both sides plunged into brutal hand-to-hand combat. It was only then that Kutuzov realized Napoleon's true intentions. He scrambled to commit all available forces to the battle for the high ground, but it was too late. Bernadotte's First Corps also joined the fray, and the French, with their overwhelming numbers, held the Pratzen Heights firmly, cutting the coalition forces in half and using their elevated position to bombard the enemy's flanks. By 1 p.m., Napoleon stood atop the Pratzen Heights, surveying his masterstroke. Davout held steadfast in the south, while Lens pursued the fleeing enemy in the north. The coalition forces were in full retreat, utterly defeated. Next, Napoleon's focus was on eliminating the trapped Russian troops held by Davout. At Austerlitz, the coalition suffered devastating losses: 36,000 men, 186 cannons, and 45 battle flags. In contrast, the French losses were minimal, with 1,288 killed and 6,991 wounded. That evening, Napoleon penned an exuberant commendation to his Grand Army: "Soldiers of the Grand Army, this great day will fade into the ocean of eternity." But even 1,000 years hence, as long as human civilization endures, they will say, "On the plains of Austerlitz, you destroyed the 76,000 Russian soldiers bought with British gold." 2 days after the battle, Emperor Francis II of Austria personally came to sue for peace. The battle had shattered his will to resist, and he accepted all of Napoleon's demands, a war indemnity of 40 million francs, ceding territories to Napoleon's ally, the Kingdom of Italy, as well as to France's allies Bavaria, Baden, and Württemberg, and allowing the German states to form the Confederation of the Rhine. This essentially marked the end of the already nominal Holy Roman Empire. This battle also caused Britain to lose Hanover and all its holdings on the European continent. At this time, William Pitt the Younger was gravely ill, and Napoleon's victory at Austerlitz was a devastating blow to him. Even on his deathbed, he urged King George III to continue resisting. A month later, Pitt, the youngest prime minister in British history, passed away at the age of 46. Britain, as Pitt hoped, did not give up the fight, nor did Russia. Moreover, Prussia wavered in the face of Napoleon's expansionist threat. From the beginning of the Third Coalition, Prussia had been hesitant. To secure Prussia's neutrality, Napoleon promised to give them Hanover after the war. But after his victory at Austerlitz, Napoleon changed his mind, intending to use Hanover as a bargaining chip in peace talks with Britain. Britain, of course, had no intention of negotiating, but was happy to inform Prussia of Napoleon's plans, igniting anti-French sentiment within Prussia. A group of fervent young officers surrounded the French embassy, sharpening their swords on its steps to demonstrate their resolve for war. At this time, King Frederick William III of Prussia was a very cautious man. Coming from a military background, he knew that the Prussian army was no longer the invincible force it had been under Frederick the Great. After 40 years of peace, they had grown complacent and unprepared for war with France, and their chances of victory were slim. However, the formation of the Confederation of the Rhine changed his mind. Prussia could not allow French influence to penetrate its heartland. Seizing the opportunity, Britain and Russia promised troops and money, ensuring Prussia would not fight alone. Frederick William ultimately sided with the coalition. On July 25, 1806, Prussia and Russia signed an alliance treaty. Frederick William then issued an ultimatum to Napoleon: withdraw French troops from the Rhine or face war. On September 25th, Napoleon made a high-profile appearance in Paris, meeting with various ambassadors. But that very night, he sped towards the front lines by carriage. There, 160,000 troops were secretly assembling, ready to march north at a moment's notice. On October 12th, Napoleon sent a letter to Frederick William: "Your Majesty still has a chance to save Prussia, for in a month it will be engulfed in flames." This arrogant and audacious letter enraged the Prussian court, but in fact, Napoleon's prediction was slightly conservative, for 2 days later, the Battle of Jena commenced. The French army advanced north in 3 columns, heading straight for Leipzig, hoping to force the Prussian main force into battle. The Prussian army totaled 200,000 men, with 90,000 stationed in various fortresses. At this time, the Prussian command debated whether to hold firm and await reinforcements or to strike offensively, but Napoleon gave them little time to decide. On October 10th, Lanz's 5th Corps encountered the Prussian vanguard, and a fierce battle ensued. A French cavalryman killed Prince Louis Ferdinand, Frederick William's cousin. Without their commander, the Prussian troops scattered, and from the prisoners, Lanz learned the location of the Prussian main force. 2 days later, Napoleon received Lanz's letter and immediately ordered a 90-degree left turn towards Jena. However, Lanz's information was outdated. At that moment, only 35,000 Prussians remained in Jena, the main force having withdrawn north. At dawn on October 14th, the Battle of Jena officially began. Lanz's 5th Corps led the charge, with French reinforcements following in close succession, holding Lanz's flanks firmly. Soult's 4th Corps showed exceptional bravery, breaking through the right flank and encircling the Prussians. By 12:30 p.m., Napoleon's 96,000 troops were fully engaged, and as they extended their wings, the Prussian troops at Jena lost their will to fight and fled the battlefield. In the pursuit, the French also dealt with the Prussian reinforcements that arrived late. Meanwhile, 20 kilometers north of Jena, in Auerstedt, Davout, ordered to march south to Jena, encountered the Prussian main force. Davout's 3rd Corps numbered 30,000 men and 46 cannons, while the Prussian main force, led by the Duke of Brunswick, had 52,000 men and 163 cannons. Despite being heavily outnumbered, Davout decided to fortify his position and hold off the Prussians. As it turned out, Davout's strategy was spot on. The Duke of Brunswick had not expected to encounter a French force during his retreat, leaving his troops unable to quickly form a proper battle line. In contrast, Davout fortified along the villages, maximizing the French skirmishers' firepower advantage, repelling wave after wave of Prussian assaults. At a critical moment, a French sniper made a crucial impact by shooting Brunswick in the eye, forcing him to leave the battlefield and hand command over to King Frederick William. However, the king hesitated, as he had received reports from Jena. If delayed by Davout for a few more hours, they would be unable to escape. At 12:15, Davout keenly noticed a halt in the Prussian advance, immediately realizing they were about to retreat. He ordered a bayonet charge. This charge shattered the already fragile Prussian morale, turning the retreat into a rout, and the rout into a massacre. In this battle, Davout's isolated corps held and crushed the Prussian main force, killing 10,000 and capturing 3,000. When the victory report reached Napoleon, he could hardly believe his eyes. After confirming the news, Napoleon expressed his admiration to the messenger. "Please tell your marshal that I will forever be grateful to him and his soldiers." 11 days later, the French army captured Berlin, with Davout and his Third Corps earning the honor of being the first to enter the city. In just 1 month of fighting, Prussia had lost 160,000 troops, 800 cannons, 250 battle flags, and most of its territory. Even Napoleon remarked, "In all my years of war, I have never seen such a complete collapse." But his war was far from over as the Russians were coming. On October 4th, 1806, Russian General Bennigsen led 86,000 Russian troops to aid Prussia. After the Battle of Jena, they were the last force on the continent capable of resisting Napoleon. By this time, the French had also reached East Prussia, only to find that, compared to this place, the Austrian countryside seemed like paradise. East Prussia had virtually no roads. The artillery units could only advance 9 kilometers a day. Temperatures dropped to as low as -30 degrees Celsius, with half the French troops suffering from frostbite or fever. Even more daunting was the fact that the impoverished local peasants had no surplus food to feed the massive army. Despite the dire situation, with cut-off supplies and heavy losses, Bennigsen was extremely cautious, using his forces prudently, leaving Napoleon without an opportunity to strike decisively. Eventually, Napoleon devised a series of feints to draw out the Russians and pursued them relentlessly to Eylau, south of Königsberg, the capital of East Prussia. On February 7, 1807, the Battle of Eylau began. This brutal engagement lasted for 2 days. At the height of the battle, a blizzard suddenly descended, reducing visibility to less than 10 meters. General Augereau's 7th Corps lost its way in the snow and ran straight into the Russian artillery. Within 15 minutes, 9,000 French troops were bombarded with grapeshot, resulting in 5,000 casualties on the spot. To save the collapsing French left flank, Murat led a devastating charge with 10,000 cavalry. This charge tore through the Russian lines, but came at a great cost, with 2,000 French cavalrymen falling in the effort. Their sacrifice bought precious time for the French to regroup. At 5 p.m. on February 8th, Davout successfully flanked the Russian rear. 2 hours later, Ney arrived on the battlefield. Realizing the risk of his forces being encircled and annihilated, Bennigsen ordered a retreat. The exhausted French, after a day of fierce combat, were unable to pursue and could only watch as the Russians withdrew. The Battle of Eylau was the bloodiest Napoleon had ever experienced. Soldiers on both sides displayed remarkable courage in the freezing conditions. By the end of the battle, it was less a contest of tactics than a battle of wills. Both sides suffered over 10,000 casualties, but neither achieved a decisive victory. For months later, Napoleon re-established his supply lines and replenished his forces with fresh recruits from France. He was finally ready to launch a counteroffensive. On June 10th, the French army advanced north and, with 10,000 casualties, captured the heavily defended Russian position at Heilsberg. Napoleon predicted that Bennigsen would retreat north, but in reality, the Russian forces were retreating east. On June 13th, Lens led the 5th Corps on a reconnaissance mission near the Alle River and stumbled upon an astonishing sight. 50,000 Russian troops were massed on the east bank, glaring at them. With only 16,000 men under his command, Lens knew Bennigsen believed he could easily crush this isolated French force, and thus ordered his army to cross the river. Lens understood that engaging the enemy could mean annihilation, but retreating would mean missing a golden opportunity. Determined to fight, he sent his aide to find Napoleon with a dire message: "I am fighting the entire Russian army." Lens then dispersed his troops, using buildings and forests to form a series of skirmish lines. The Russians needed to capture each defensive point to advance, while the French could fall back to the next line and reorganize. The French fought a tactical retreat from dawn until dusk, delaying the Russians for 9 hours. Just as Lens was about to be overwhelmed, French reinforcements finally arrived. Upon receiving Lens' plea for help, Napoleon realized this was a rare opportunity. He ordered his entire army to march swiftly towards Friedland. By 5 p.m. on June 13th, the vanguard reached the battlefield. The main body of the Russian army had crossed the river and now had no choice but to fight with their backs to the water. On the afternoon of June 14th, Napoleon ordered a full assault. Ney's 6th Corps led the charge, pushing the Russian left wing toward the center with relentless attacks. This concentration of 50,000 Russian troops in the narrow valley made them perfect targets for French artillery. Napoleon ordered an infantry assault to cover the advancing cannons, which moved from 600 meters to just 55 meters from the Russians. For months earlier, the horrors of Eylau were replayed. French artillery fired grapeshot at point-blank range, killing 4,000 Russian soldiers and shattering their morale. Friedland was engulfed in flames, and desperate Russian soldiers jumped into the river, their cries echoing through the air. In this battle, the French, with 8,000 casualties, defeated 20,000 Russians, decimating the main Russian force. It's worth noting that 7 years earlier to the day, Napoleon had won his most perilous battle at Marengo, beginning his path to European conquest. Now, with another victory, he concluded this legendary journey. On June 25th, 1807, Napoleon and Tsar Alexander I met on a raft on the Neman River at Tilsit. The location was chosen to signify that Russia was negotiating as an equal, not as a defeated nation. The young Tsar expressed his respect by saying, "Sire, in the future, I will be the second most hated man by the British." Napoleon responded by extending his right hand in friendship, "Then let us be at peace." Over the next few days, Alexander and Napoleon engaged in cordial and friendly discussions, forming a brotherly alliance between France and Russia. Of course, the one who paid the price for this unbreakable alliance was Prussia. In stark contrast to Napoleon's treatment of Alexander, Frederick William received no such respect. When a Tsar entered the city, the French army fired a 100-gun salute in his honor, and Napoleon himself went out to greet him, housing him in the finest mansion. When the Prussian king entered the city, there was no salute, no greeting, and he was lodged in a local miller's house. The ensuing meetings were humiliating for Frederick William. Prussia had to cede territory north and west of the Rhine to the Confederation of the Rhine, and all of Poland's land, with the eastern part going to Russia and the remainder forming the Duchy of Warsaw. Additionally, Prussia was to pay an exorbitant war indemnity of 120 million francs to France. This treaty stripped Prussia of 1/3 of its territory and half of its population, but Frederick William had no choice but to comply. He vowed that this humiliation would one day be repaid tenfold. Napoleon, at this point, was indifferent to Frederick William's feelings. From the warm coasts of Iberia to the cold valleys of the Eastern European plains, from the fortified bastions on the Rhine to the prosperous towns of the Apennine Peninsula, nations had to either accept French rule or become France's allies. Not since the fall of the Roman Empire had Europe seen such a powerful empire. Even the empire of Charlemagne at its height had not reached such dominion. At this moment, Napoleon stood as the true master of Europe. Napoleon's military career saw him engaged in over 60 battles, surpassing the likes of Alexander, Hannibal, and Caesar not just in frequency, but also in his remarkable win rate and numerous instances of defeating larger and stronger forces. If someone's achievements overshadow their contemporaries, we might attribute it to their unparalleled military genius. But if those achievements stand out throughout history, it reflects significant changes in their era. The change that defined Napoleon's time was the French Revolution. It awakened nationalism, stirred patriotic fervor, established an efficient mobilization system, and created an egalitarian relationship between officers and soldiers. The difference between the new army and the old was qualitative, and Napoleon was undoubtedly the military leader who understood this best. During the Napoleonic Wars, France mobilized nearly 2 million soldiers, representing 7% of the total population. In comparison, France's mobilization rate during World War I was 9%. Mobilizing an army requires the populace to understand why they are fighting. Sustaining an army necessitates a modern financial and fiscal system. Managing an army demands an efficient, egalitarian grassroots military organization. This was beyond the reach of old Europe, even with British gold. Of course, this system was not without flaws. A significant issue was the insufficient training of conscripted soldiers. Napoleon addressed this by cutting back on formation drills and increasing firearms and bayonet training, aligning with his tactical approach. What was Napoleon's strategy? In his words, "The essence of war is concentrating more force at the point of attack and defense than the enemy." Achieving this requires delegation and splitting forces. To achieve this, Napoleon pioneered the corps system, with each corps comprising infantry, cavalry, and artillery. Commanders had to be capable of independently reading the battlefield and making decisions. Once war began, each corps advanced separately, reducing supply strain and increasing opportunities to engage the enemy. Upon encountering the enemy, they would hold them in place, buying time for other corps to encircle them. This system allowed Napoleon to execute imaginative strategies such as flanking maneuvers, encirclements, diverting reinforcements, luring enemies in, and converging attacks. Faced with these new tactics, old armies often had no choice but to react defensively. Could old armies simply copy these methods? Not easily. The biggest issue with traditional armies was desertion. When units were spread out or cut off from supplies, their numbers would dwindle faster than in battle. Additionally, the traditional command structure was hierarchical. Disrupting it could cause political, not just military, issues. This explains why Napoleon's ranks were filled with exceptional generals, while the coalition forces had fewer. The criteria for selecting commanders differed. One required independent thinking, the other strict adherence to orders. What tactics did Napoleon's highly mobile and aggressive new army employ? In summary, 3 key elements: skirmishers, artillery, and bayonets. As mentioned earlier, skirmishers in open formation had higher shooting efficiency than dense lines, though they were less effective in bayonet charges. Thus, French skirmish tactics were often paired with defensive positions, with orderly strategic withdrawals as the enemy approached. This required soldiers to have a high level of combat awareness, remaining calm under pressure and adaptable to changing situations. For defense, they relied on skirmishers. For offense, artillery and bayonets were the mainstays. Throughout the Napoleonic Wars, most casualties were inflicted by artillery, as direct engagements were typically brief. The French would use artillery to create breaches, followed by column formations charging with bayonets. In essence, Napoleon used infantry columns like classical cavalry, emphasizing swift, decisive strikes. This explains why French training was simplified. Mastering shooting allowed for effective defense, while mastering the bayonet enabled effective offense. The precise, timed formation drills of Frederick the Great's era were no longer suitable for this period. Napoleon had a unique understanding of victory. In prior wars, cavalry's decline made decisive battles rare in the firearm era. But things had changed. At Jena, the French annihilated an entire nation in one battle, and Austerlitz ended the Holy Roman Empire. Napoleon knew the value of victory and how to capitalize on it. This is why he could build an expansive, unprecedentedly powerful empire in just 7 years. However, this empire was founded on his military victories. To sustain it, he needed more and greater victories, an increasingly difficult task. His enemies were evolving, learning from the French, with Napoleon as their best teacher. This journey was far from over. It had just begun. Napoleon had to tread carefully, avoiding every pitfall and winning every battle. But could he truly achieve this? That's what we'll explore in the next installment. In the next episode, we'll focus on the critical mistakes Napoleon made that ultimately led to the downfall of his empire. We'll analyze which of these errors were avoidable and which were not. We'll also see why the French army lost its invincibility and why Napoleon's military victories could no longer support his political ambitions. Additionally, we'll witness the tragic end of heroic figures and one of the most disastrous campaigns in human history.